Evening to everybody. Welcome to this, I lose count actually how many of these LSE London events which were designed to coincide with both the run up to and now the path away from the local elections, and particularly the London Mayoral election in May this month. My name's Tony Travers from the LSE, and with my colleagues, we've arranged this series of events really to try to bring together a mixture of practitioners, public and others, with experts in the field of London government to look at a number of topics, some of them service related, some of them, like today, more a matter of public policy. Now, I'll introduce our panel in a moment, but the title is something of a giveaway, really. It's sort of London and Whitehall, levelling up or down. Now, this is a major facet of British public policy as we speak, really, the levelling up agenda. And I think it begins, well, in many ways, the question about whether or not Britain and regions in Britain need to be levelled up probably has its origins in the 1920s, certainly not at the Brexit referendum, although that is the modern point when this kind of debate begins. But I think what we're really talking about here is an issue that has been, a part of British politics since the Jarrow March, if not before that. And it has to do with the fact that London and its region, the wider southeast, has been capable of growing economically relatively rapidly, particularly the wider region, decade after decade, as industrial change has affected other parts of the country, the North, the Midlands, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, substantially more. The Southwest, of course, being a slightly different case, different again. And the modern starting point, I think, for the debate about levelling up was indeed the Brexit vote in 2016, when by 52 to 48, the people of the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union. But the pattern of votes in that election, where London voted 60-40 to remain, in other parts of the country, notably parts of the Midlands and the north of England, were very heavily 7-3, kind of 70-30 kind of votes in some places for leave. And part of that vote, it was believed, that it was significantly about leaving the EU, captured other things about the way people perceived government working for them and about the way they felt about their lives, their culture, their identity. A whole load of things rolled into one. We don't need to go into all of that today, save to say that one of the issues that emerged and has been picked up by politics, particularly the Conservative Party and particularly at the 2019 election, is the notion of levelling up, i.e. trying to bring the GDP per head, the life chances and so on in Midlands and the North up to the level of London and the wider southeast. I think that's a simplification. Our speakers may correct me if I've got that wrong, but I think that's broadly in its most positive way what it's about. So it does create this dynamic of question which actually the Labour government, when it set up sort of regional development policies when it took office in 1997, set targets for regions to grow faster to catch up with London and the southeast. That, as it turned out, didn't occur. And so here we are in 2021 with a policy that's very heavily discussed in terms of regions. It's about helping northern regions, Midlands regions, and increasingly Scotland, because of the union, to catch up with the economic prosperity of the southeast. But as many will have observed, not only in London, arguably levelling up should be about people or people and households rather than about regions. That is, there are very many deprived and left behind people and households in London and the southeast and the east, and there are plenty of affluent areas and people in the Midlands and the north. So against that backdrop, how should policy evolve, and particularly how should London think about this in its own terms in relation to the rest of the UK and so on. That's just to set the scene. At the moment, there's a certain amount of, there are pots of cash being allocated for various purposes, such as the Towns Fund and the Levelling Up Fund, and soon the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Some discussion about investments in post-school education and so on. But the precise details of the policy, I think, are still work in progress. Anyway, enough from me. Now we're going to hear from 3 speakers, as I said. And I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. So Councillor Clare Coghill, who is the leader of the London Borough of Waltham Forest, also has roles at the Local Government Association and is the executive member for skills and employment at London Councils, which is the umbrella body for the London boroughs. Nick Walkley was formerly chief executive of Barnet, then of Haringey, and then most recently chief executive of Homes England, which is a national government agency distributing resources and otherwise encouraging house building across England. And third, Jonathan Werran, who is the chief executive of Localis, which is a think tank, an England-wide, I mean, maybe Britain-wide actually, Jonathan, but anyway, countrywide, nationwide think tank, formerly a journalist, and also worked in the charity sector, I think. So that's it, really. So over to you. So Clare, welcome and thank you for taking part today.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's lovely to be with everyone today and lovely to be introduced by you. But the things that you say at the top of a discussion always get me thinking. So it's always a bit harder to speak after I've listened to you, but hopefully what I come out with will be that bit better. I think people who can hear my accent will know that I'm originally from the West Midlands. I'm a Dudley girl, born and bred. I grew up in a bellwether constituency that voted for Margaret Thatcher, then John Major, then Tony Blair, then David Cameron, and has continued to vote Tory. And I think one of the key things that I bring to London politics is a real understanding of what the choices are that people make and why they make those decisions, and to ensure that people's quality of life improves and that they see possibilities for their children to have a good quality of life that's on a par with their own or better is really fundamental to politics. And I think politicians who don't get that and who don't understand that have really, really lost their way. I think one of the key reasons why the Conservatives have done so well in other parts of the country is that the traditional working class vote doesn't automatically vote Labour anymore, and hasn't done for a really, really long time. As a child of the Midlands, I grew up with a family who knew poverty but voted Tory. I went to school with kids whose parents knew unemployment as a result of decisions made by the Conservative governments at the time, and continue to vote Conservative. And I think there's this real sort of, I think the political debate around this has really, really lost its way to the point where it's meaningless to people, and where the politicians who can sort of piece together any kind of story do quite well. But it fails to be honest about what the problems are. I'm really glad, Tony, that you mentioned what the Blair government sought to do, because I can remember that, you know, people like when we still had Labour MPs in Stoke-on-Trent, one of them had a picture in her office of a brownfield site, and everybody she came into contact with, she said, "Do you want to buy this site?" She had this enormous A3 picture in her office and said, "Do you want to buy it?" And I was like, "I'm an intern, I don't really have that." And she went, yeah, but I ask everybody, "Do you want to buy it? Because this is the only way my community is going to survive." And that, to my knowledge, that's never happened, because it's about the reality of those communities in the Midlands and the North. They used to have trades and specialist trades that were desirable by people who were purchasing products or elements of products that were purchased across the world, across this country, across the world. And when those communities aren't producing coal or primary materials, when they're not producing goods and when they're not equipped because they don't have the infrastructure to support services, and they certainly can't compete with London's ability to provide services, then they are inevitably going to be left behind. And it's how we start to have an honest conversation about the skills that are required in those communities. That's what will make the difference. Because as long as we're kidding on to kids in Blackpool and Burnley and Birmingham and all these other places that I've been to and love very, very much because they're fun and they're great. But as long as we kid on to those kids that if they just get 5 GCSEs and if they just get a BTEC, that they'll be fine, they won't. And as long as we're telling those lies to our young people, frankly, multi-million-pound organisations that are operating globally will not choose the Midlands and the North in this country to invest. And there are not enough internal jobs to meet the needs of the population in the Midlands and the North of this country. And we need to be, and that's not even talking about the Southwest and the Southeast that at its geographical extremes also struggle considerably. So my plea really is, please don't take away London's ability to compete globally, thinking that you're going to be able to give a bit of cash here and there to Huddersfield and Hartlepool and that it'll all be all right, because it won't. London has the capacity and to a large extent does support the national economy. And we need to see it as an example, as a conduit for growth and its connectivity as something massively powerful and important. And there are plenty of economic migrants like me who've ended up in London, who will do everything that we can to provide those connections and that support to other parts of the country. And I really, really hope that the opportunities there are grasped. But we have to have an honest conversation with the general public, particularly young people, about what this will take in terms of growth, in terms of investment, and in terms of really understanding that you're going to need some proper qualifications to get a great job. And if we have a highly qualified, highly skilled workforce, we will become a powerhouse once again in the global bid for growth. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Claire. And actually a great reminder that though the UK as a whole has pretty dismal productivity, London has very high, and the South East have very high productivity. And were that productivity to be replicated in the way that you're suggesting through individuals getting better jobs, the productivity and the levelling up problems would both be solved in one go. So thank you for that. And a vote for post-school education there too. So thanks. We'll come back to you soon, I'm sure, Claire. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks, Claire, as well, for the name check of my place of birth, Huddersfield. Not just me, but the captain of the Starship Enterprise, an Oscar winner, and one of the finest prime ministers of the 20th century, a fine, fine town in its own right. When reflecting on this, and clearly having worked in London local government and at the centre, had expected to be less than sympathetic towards the current mayor. And those who've known me for some time will know that I've not been a huge fan of the current GLA construct. But actually, I ended up feeling rather sorry for Sadiq. And that's because if you look at what will happen in his second term, this ought to be a really positive opportunity for him and his leadership. So the London plan has finally cleared its hurdles. One can move to use it as a document for delivery rather than discussion. Jules Pipe can stop wearing the tie and look rather more relaxed on a day-to-day basis. Likewise, on transport, Crossrail will open, and it ought to be that moment where the much, much heralded second kick in development values and feeling the benefit of better connectivity drives through the city. And on the economy, actually, the city has got through Brexit, and whilst it's not unscathed, it's not been the sort of toxic shock that many expected. And so, were it not for events of the last 14 months, one could argue that this is a pretty good setup for a second-term mayor. But of course, what we face instead is a housing market where demand continues to massively outstrip supply, but real estate more generally in a real sense of turmoil about where values will lie. Transport now completely bedeviled by the TfL crisis. And the economy in this really sort of phony war about what happens next. And I began to think, actually, the questions were all about what should the institution do. I think this is genuinely a moment to look to the high points of the previous two mayoralties and ask some questions about where are the alliances rather than the powers that are going to pull London through this next phase and meet some of the challenges. And when you do that, I think many people may have been expecting me for the next 4 minutes to just bang on about the difficult relationship between the boroughs and the mayor. But I think this is really a moment, particularly given the levelling up agenda, for the mayoralty to look beyond those institutional relationships. And I think there are three really positive opportunities here. The first is, with the honourable exceptions of Ben Houchen and Andy Street, city governance is now Labour territory. And Labour territory in a party that isn't embarrassed by its leadership. And what we did face over the past 4 years was a sort of an uncomfortable alliance between different parts of the Labour Party, which made leadership on policy issues really difficult. Actually, Steve Rotherham, Andy, through the new mayoralties and into Sadiq, could of its own right become a very powerful leadership voice around some key themes. And that represents, I think, for London, a really big opportunity. And I see it as really smart politics and institutional thinking for Sadiq to be in Yorkshire today, you know, in a very Boris move, looking at expensive buses. You know, it's straight out of that playbook, and fair play to him for doing it. But actually it goes further than that, doesn't it? Because some of the articulation, particularly of Burnham and Rotherham of the past year, is really useful for London around in-work poverty, poverty at the margins. These are themes that will chime more generally, and others may be able to do the heavy lifting. I think secondly, and really, really surprisingly, the pandemic may have changed the dynamic of the relationship between the wider South East and London. We all now do know how dependent the South East is upon London workplaces, because we took away the workplaces and lo and behold, we saw massive shifts in demand, further price bubbles, which have created massive pressure in some South London councils for further growth in housing. And I think in that space, there is a new opportunity to have a conversation about what London means within a wider South East economic engine, and the fact we now have a Labour mayor of the Cambridge Combined Authority represents a first opportunity to begin to have those questions about what growth means in that context. But I think the third thing is the most important, and it's just a sort of grim world economic reality. Business needs Sadiq to lead the mayoralty and lead London at this moment as it faces multiple challenges. But actually Sadiq needs business, because he needs business to be with him in a conversation about levelling up. The money for levelling up is not going to come from government. It will be just leverage. The money will have to come from large-scale institutional capital. And as Claire rightly said, from major corporations taking decisions about where and how to invest. And actually a confident London mayor working with London-based institutions can do an awful lot in that space to both win friends and win influence and make London first amongst many equals. So I think there's a really interesting thing here about encouraging Sadiq to get out more and to engage and build different alliances. But I have a feeling he might be welcomed with really open arms.
Okay, you're done. Sorry, Nick, I was just typing a message to Fanny about the... Are you done?
Yeah, was I boring you, Tony? Sorry.
No. I was just trying to make sure that we get enough of the questions are coming in. So thank you for that. I heard every word. Thank you for the avoidance of doubt. Jonathan.
Many thanks, Tony. Many thanks, Claire and Nick, going ahead of me, setting a scene. From a think tank perspective, levelling up, what is it, first of all? We've been asking this question for a long time. Essentially, sort of Boris Johnson, the Johnson government knew from the summer of 2019 what it had to do and say in the run-up to the steep and rather high path which was the 2019 Brexit election. There had to be a policy which addressed and spoke to the red wall seats. It had to finish off the botched job from Theresa May's 2017 election. And it had to connect the water torture of endless Brexit negotiations with the vision of a sunlit upland of domestic peace and plenty. Now, from the recent Queen's speech, we've now got a level of what levelling up means. Levelling up means creating new good jobs, boosting training and growing productivity in places that have seen economic decline and the loss of industry, not through a one-size-fits-all approach, but nurturing different types of economic growth and building on the different strengths that different places have. 4 years ago, when I first joined the Cardis, when we had a formerly interventionist industrial strategy, we put out a report about the making of industrial strategy in which we made the distinction between the stuck and the stifled. Now, the stuck referred to places still dealing with the structural fallout of the mid-80s, the industrial trauma, and stifled places, those that were growing quickly, but whose ability to grow was hemmed in by their geography, their boundaries. We recognise both types as being of increasing political importance, but to govern is to choose. And the levelling up road just taken seems firmly addressed to meeting the needs of the former, the stuck, and for the latter, including London and the South East, may be seen as levelling down. Levelling up and down with London, well, although ostensibly an economic project, the levelling up agenda reflects above all a shift in central government's understanding of the new political geography. The economic has become subsidiary to this understanding of a new political map of England. Despite Sean Bailey showing better than expected recently, it suggests the only vote that counts, the likely 2023 general election, will be framed around holding on to the electoral coalition that delivered last time, the former red wall, while keeping the blue wall in the south against any demographic or planning chaos changes. As Nick said, no, the same probably applies to the other core cities where the Conservatives are, on average, about 25% down per parliamentary constituency. Beyond the direct electoral benefits, however, the levelling up agenda also reflects concerns that have been raised, as Tony was saying, for many years, about the over-leveraging of the British economy on London. Agglomeration is key to growth, but to have an entire nation's eggs, cultural, economic and political, emanating entirely from one mega agglomeration does not perhaps seem sensible and has led to the underinvestment in other regions, leading to the continued productivity gap. Investment in other conurbations like the Northern Powerhouse, as shown to some extent in Manchester, is key to cutting the deficits which all English regions, except London and the South East and the East, currently run with the Exchequer. However, the recovery and growth of London is key to underwriting the kind of spending that a proper levelling up will require. So the conundrum presented is one where cities are increasingly politically irrelevant to the government, but economically they remain the principal drivers of growth. The lack of high-value employment outside of London can only be solved by increasing high-value employment in our other core major cities, first and foremost, Manchester and Birmingham. That's how you build your agglomeration economies. The long-term benefits of spreading out London's growth to other key and core cities and then out from those cities to their hinterlands does not, however, answer the political question. People voted Conservative in small and large towns in the north, some of which are not particularly hard up, some of which are, but they need to be delivered material benefits for having voted so. So there's, on the one hand, what London can offer to boost the former, the economic agglomeration, and then there's the latter, the political reward for the Conservative government, which London can seemingly help pay for. There's a real chance that in the short term politically, London might be totally left out, which would be extremely detrimental to the national economy. I don't think there's a credible long-term case where we recover and build back better without London leading. Balancing the political and the economic, we're left with where George Osborne got to, the language of deals and deal making. And I think the principal risk is that the real economic case gets lost in the pursuit of the political gains. And that's why, in terms of what London can do, it's important to build bridges and create some kind of framework whereby the government can work with the GLA, which we'll come to shortly. Now, how's this seen externally? External perceptions are important. How the government deals with levelling up in London, of course, remains to be seen, as does the difference between the Levelling Up White Paper and the previously released prospectus for the Levelling Up Fund. Now, those of us on the localist bandwagon who are asking for nothing more than maybe an adequately funded local state might suggest proper funding, as the National Audit Office were calling for in their report on the pandemic response, which maybe obviate the sort of tournament financing, bidding for cash pots, as seen by the Levelling Up Fund, and which I'm sure many council officers watching here are loving at the moment. Now, the more cynical amongst us might suggest that the purpose of the Levelling Up Fund is to serve as kind of useful catnip for the Chancellor to divert the Red Wall MPs seeking money to improve their high streets and civic amenities, while the proper job of joining up the dots is left to Neil O'Brien as Levelling Up advisor. Going back to Neil O'Brien, he wrote in The Spectator just before the Olympics in 2012, he said in July that year, London has always been different from the rest of the country, but in recent decades, the differences have widened to the point that economically and socially, the capital now has little in common with the rest of Britain. Those attending shouldn't kid themselves they've visited Britain. London has effectively left the UK. It belongs instead to a loose international federation of global cities united by their economic dynamism and cosmopolitanism and the people who flit between them. And O'Brien continued, this leads to a big problem, Londonitis, as he called it. He said, the politicians, civil servants and journalists who make up Britain's governing class have had their worldview shaped by living in the capital and its wealthy satellites. They run one country, but effectively live in another. Now, while this view of a city full of rootless cosmopolitans flitting effortlessly between London, New York and Sao Paulo may not ring true for most Londoners, there is a glimmer of hope in it that there's an acknowledgement of its powerhouse status. And if this is to set the tone for the White Paper's attitude, maybe politically talking down London, but economically and quite subtly admitting how important it is, I think as Londoners, we could possibly live with that, so long as London is given the tools to provide the fuel for the country's recovery. As ever, the great risk is that if London's stripped of its resources, it shrinks growth in the other cities and therefore the national economy, even as the government is borrowing to fund growth in the north, and that's ratcheting up, creating an inflationary problem of low to no growth amid an escalating deficit. Other external views, pay attention to the work and ambitions of the Northern Research Group of Tory MPs. It's led by former Northern Powerhouse Minister Jake Berry, who knows where the bodies are buried, and it's modelled on our good friends, the ERG from Brexit days. So it's be worth watching as they make a probably very powerful case for a shift in resourcing. I spoke recently with a council chief from the north who'd had in a previous life direct experience of working in London's economic growth sphere, and they suggested from their new perspective a bit of levelling down would be the sort of radical medicine we'd need to rebalance as a country. Here at the Carlist, we've been looking at this area in research we're doing for London councils. We're surveying the extent and scope of the mayor's governance powers in terms of relationships to Whitehall, the 32 London boroughs and the City of London, as well as the relations with the mayoral combined authorities across England. Translating the Queen's speech, it does read suspiciously like a zero-sum game in which London's economic, political and cultural preeminence must be reduced so that others might prosper. It's not a theory of traditional economic growth we'd like to recognise, and for our money, we can only level up the country if London continues to grow. So the question comes down to London. How do we address or redress this rebalancing it? I think in the first instance, we got to thaw out the relationship between London and central government. How do we thaw the relationship and move forward? Well, we can't help the fact political differences between a London Labour Mayor, Sadiq Khan, and a Conservative government are there. It's an inherent problem. We've seen it last year, this exclusion from COBRA meetings and lack of meaningful contact, obviously mirrored across quite abysmal central-local relations last year. In terms of levelling up, the shift means that Sadiq and our metro mayors are going to learn how to do deals for things that benefit towns and wider travel to work areas in other parts. It's transactional. It's a what can I do for you attitude, but that's the game in town. In terms of other mayoral models, Sadiq could do perhaps well to learn from Ken Livingstone's shtick in presenting himself as an honest rogue who will let everyone from whatever political hue know first and foremost what he wants at the outset before offering his trade. In this sense, councils and the sub-regional groupings, your local London, central London forwards, are crucial to breaking the impasse. With our London boroughs, the practical business of governance can outstrip party political concerns. I think there's been admirable work, the work done across boroughs in central London to try to battle the effects of the pandemic, especially business support, has been a perfect example of this type of working. In terms of the GLA, it must use its partnership with the boroughs and particularly work on those relationships with flagship Tory councils, both in and around the outskirts of London, to establish better working relationships based on achievement of outcomes, which are crucial to everyone going forwards. Our kind of research identified many key areas of shared priorities across central government, the mayor and the boroughs. I think, as Claire said, skills first and foremost, and these shared priorities have to be the focus. So in terms of this kind of trade-off, central government needs things from London. What does it need most of all? It needs London's continued growth and investment. Simply put, growth and investment can be created in London with far less government money, effort and intervention than anywhere else in the country. Likewise, London needs things from central government, including increased autonomy and greater revenue raising powers to achieve this growth and investment. Any guesses, Tony? Who said the following words on 19th July 2012? The capital must not be seen simply as a cash cow for the rest of the UK, and the time has come for London to take greater control of its own destiny. I firmly believe that Londoners should see more of the growing tax revenues they generate for the public purse staying here in the capital. Answers on the postcard, please. So, to sum up, to positively improve things, the mayor should set out his stall for a new approach, a borrowed size approach, in which London's relationships to the other city regions in London can be capitalised on for common benefit, offering something rather in the spirit of selflessness in the hope of some kind of tangible reward. This would extend not just to the home counties, but to the mayoral combined authorities. Change the conversation. If it's to be effective, the real work of the levelling up agenda has to turn up the temperature in England's economic hotspots outside of London, the core cities. Understanding that this is the central task means moving past the bun fight of devolution discourse, where increasingly the task of research, it seems to us, is simply to prove how one area is deserving while another isn't. So to really level up, there's got to be a conversation on decentralisation, one that focuses on relationships and interrelationships, shared goals of spreading prosperity across the country, and easing some of the socio-economic pressures on London. So to conclude, going forward, Sadiq's got to be proactive in working to create a new framework for working with central government, a relationship that better stresses the bipartisan, the shared priorities of the London boroughs, the GLA and central government. In its turn, central government's got to realise that whatever the political case for maybe attacking or sidelining London might be, the economic case for doing so doesn't exist. So under a new deal for the city, London and the South East will, we hope, remain the cash providers, providing the fiscal surplus, which will enable not just the levelling up, but hopefully the healthy functioning of a British state which will survive into the future, or certainly into the next spending review and beyond. So it's all from me, Tony. Over to you.
Great, Jonathan. That was wonderful. And from all three of you, that was very, very clear, very good. Three very direct presentations with a whole range of challenges in them. If I just sort of get us going with, well, 2 points really. One is the fairly obvious thought that there are, but whatever we, and if we just take the Neil O'Brien article about London as a whole and the way levelling up is being interpreted so far in government, by any stretch of the imagination, there are parts of London, including some in the London Borough of Waltham Forest, and indeed others here represented, which need that kind of help. Or there are households, there are people who live there who need that kind of levelling up help. So I suppose my first challenge is, how is it possible to convince government that the very notion that they're pursuing here isn't only, or shouldn't only be, about regions, but it should be about smaller areas, or more to the point, people and households? Because that seems to me where there is a sort of a gap in the argument here. I mean, otherwise, as I've said 100 times before, probably in this series, you are, arguing for levelling up from the rich of Barking and Dagenham to the poor of Harrogate, which kind of, you only have to say it. There are large numbers of places in London which are at one end of a spectrum, and large numbers of places in the Midlands and the North that are at the other. So, I mean, what is sort of London policy? What are London policymakers not getting right for having not got this point through? And not only to Conservative politicians, because I doubt, Claire will know this better than me, I doubt Labour politicians feel very differently deep down. That Andy Burnham doesn't suggest he, well, I say stop there, shall I? Anyway, Claire, what about what?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I was on a call yesterday with other local government leaders, and I'm pleased that you've name-checked B&D, because it was very much intra-Labour conversations between leaders and councillors from outside London and those of us in London. And it's a sense of, well, it's all right for you in London. It's like, well, we've got our own political challenges and we have our own risks. I think one of the things that, and it was really, the contributions from Nick and Jonathan, I'm glad I went first because I'd have been intimidated to go last. And I knew I needed to come correct because it's a Tony session. So I was thinking about Rome this morning in preparation. But I think it's that thing of taking it for granted. My grandparents' generation thought that there would always be work in the Midlands and that I would have some sort of job in management, not like they'd had, but some sort of job in management in a business somewhere in Dudley or Birmingham, or a public sector job. Well, those jobs don't exist anymore. And in the North, plenty of people thought that their kids would work in the factories that they'd worked in and that their parents worked in. And all of that is gone. And I think the real challenges, and why I was thinking about Rome, was that Rome was absolutely tickety-boo until the Ostrogoths rolled into town. You think it's all fine, but you take it for granted and you risk losing it altogether. And I think, to bring it back to, the Brexit points that you were making at the top, COVID has really created this sense that, perhaps we don't need to worry about Brexit. We absolutely do. There are fundamental existential risks to various sectors within London. And if London starts to fall apart at the seams, and cities do that all the time, cities have great periods of growth and expansion and dominance, and then that can all shrivel away to nothing. That's already happened in this country in different cities, but because it's not been the capital where it's happened, it's not been felt perhaps so acutely. I think you're absolutely right. Andy Burnham is a great politician and I like him personally, but it gets my goat really when I hear him having a pop about London as if we're this big homogenous lump. It's like, well, actually, those swanky bits of Manchester where the football players live, there's only one street like that in my borough. And Teddy Sheringham lives there. No, sorry, I'm being silly now. But you know what I mean? You're exactly right. And we need to be more nuanced and sophisticated as politicians, because frankly, these really sort of blunt, us and them, north and south assertions don't work, and the more nuanced conversations that someone like Andy Street has been able to have with the people of Birmingham, what was always a Labour city chock full of Labour MPs, he's been able to have a more grown-up and nuanced conversation with the public, and they voted for him again.
Okay, very good. Nick, and then Jonathan. I mean, what about this sort of the levelling up needs of London question?
So I think I'm going to be rarely respectful of former civil service colleagues here. And I think it's really helpful to reflect on, there have been a couple of pieces recently in The Economist and an excellent blog by Rachel Wolfe articulating what is levelling up now and what isn't it. What it very definitely is the retail politics of how do we continue to hold this curious coalition together until we figure out some really big and profound economic questions, which are questions about how do you buck the agglomeration economics of the past 20 years and globalization and manage them in a way that allows us to tackle the sort of endemic inequalities that we see across the United Kingdom, both within places and without. And I think we should be really careful not to see what's happening at the moment as anything more than those first moves. As the system as a whole, and not just the politicians, the civil servants, the think tanks, everybody buys some time to deal with those issues. And that's why I think a strategy of early influence and experimentation becomes really, really important in this space. From my own point of view, given my background in housing, it feels to me that there is a really significant conversation to be had about what the access to sort of basic services feels like across the country. Because if you live in large parts of the north, it is true that if you're holding down a reasonable job in the public sector or beyond hourly rates, then a combination of Help to Buy or other products have made home ownership and car ownership pretty achievable and provide a stable and interesting lifestyle. It just excludes large numbers of other individuals. But that good growth problem is one that isn't going to be resolved in a single economic cycle and asks much more profound questions about where the UK invests. And I think rather than seeing, the announcement of another damned form to fill in for another version of hanging baskets or beautification of street corners as being the end game, my sense is there are bigger wheels now turning about that longer term investment, which we should be looking to influence and drive policy direction around. And I think at that level, local leadership is much more united, as Localis have articulated, around practical problem solving to deliver that kind of growth than the big noise, big politics indicates. And I think those solutions are where we should be looking, rather than, in the hope that some grand theory is going to emerge out of Whitehall in the next 4 years, because I just don't think it is, because it isn't anywhere globally at the moment. These are problems that lots of places are struggling with. But I think articulating what that basic service offer looks and feels like, what access to housing, what access to health does, and why it's good for the economy, we need to go back to some of those nuts and bolts. I mean, that's, kind of found, water and sewage acts of Birmingham basic stuff that we may need to re-articulate.
And Jonathan, Claire mentioned at the beginning and again actually just now, I mean, and the government in the Queen's speech gave prominence to post-school non-university education. And it clearly is an absolutely essential element in trying to ensure that the workforce in all parts of the UK is skilled to the point that footloose companies wish to invest in any of them, in the way that they can turn up at Wokingham or Reading and any of these towns around southwest of London, and there'll be a trained workforce. They can open their company and that, their new tech company, and there it is, or even in northeast London these days. But that's not true of lots of other places. How far do you think the government is apprised of the need radically to lift the status of further education, and indeed to make it very, very attractive for people to get into the reskilling that we all know is required? It's a real kind of emergency. That's the one thing that could be done quickly, radically, to alter everything.
Yeah, clearly it's the further education, the Cinderella of all the Cinderellas. If you look at what they've been suffering from, not just through austerity, but through all the reconfigurations into the decades before then. Clearly, a few years ago, everyone was obsessed with the impact of automation, what that's going to do with the jobs market, and then the confluence of that with Brexit and all these other labour market shocks. It's clear that it's something to be done there, but the danger is how's it, as Tony Blair articulated, that he could declare war on a day when he's delivering a speech about skills policy or further education. Nobody seems to listen. How's it going to get that pull through? And and the other danger in terms of London is it's that if anything, foreign direct investment in London has concentrated more and more. So you might have better run further education colleges offering skills, digital skills especially, for the workforce of the future. But getting that investment channeled through to the regions, weaning private sector off investment in London and its hinterland will be the other side to that. So it's skills and jobs. They've got to be seen as one and the same. Clearly, we've got some configurations in central government. How the business department, which now doesn't have industrial strategy so much in its rubric, but seems to be not sure whether it's hoovering up or disgorging more of its the government's growth agenda to the cabinet office through the levelling up agenda. It remains to be seen. How it gets connected up by the centre will be, I think, sort of crucial to that.
Okay, very good. Now I'm going to move on to some of the questions that have come in on the chat and Q&A. So first one, which is topical because there's been another announcement about this today, and I think MHCLG, Clare, is moving some of its staff to Wolverhampton, so to the Black Country. So do panel members think there's any potential value in relocating government departments away from London and into the regions? Now, this could be both in London and in the regions, actually. So what about this, the relocation policy? Nick, was Homes England relocated when you were there or afterwards?
We'd already moved. It was a fairly straightforward thing for us to do because 70% of the staff don't work in London.
Right.
Two observations here. The first is, I think very definitely moving staff out of Whitehall is an excellent idea, particularly into the Midlands and Leeds, because it will at least give us another justification for HS2. People will be able to get to and from ministerial meetings much more quickly. Actually, the real challenge is the magnetic pull of ministerial and parliamentary power. And
that's a polite way of saying you think. But do we? I mean, sorry to ask a cruel question. I mean, how many? I know the government is saying ministers will spend a day or two a week there, and so on. But the truth is that, the Treasury is going to near the current Chancellor's constituency, and MHC is going near to the current Community Secretary's constituency. So what happens when, like Philip Hammond, the Chancellor's in Runnymede, and So I don't know, Clare becomes Secretary of State for Communities in the future? I mean, that'd be all right actually for you, Clare. But how's it going to work when the Secretary of State comes from somewhere else?
So look, it's admirable to move jobs elsewhere in the country. There is no doubt about that. The shared experience of Whitehall does get in the way of listening to very different views and different voices. But administrative devolution and office devolution is no substitute for political devolution that allows local communities to make decisions that don't require hulking great ministries because much of the power is devolved elsewhere. I think it may end up being a sort of a really interesting cul-de-sac that has some marginal benefits but doesn't tackle the underpinning problems, which goes to, I wanted to make a point in response to the comment about skills. I think skills devolution is a really, really important thing to do, but it implies that there is a sense that there's going to be some prioritisation of what happens where and why. And, you know, one of my experiences in my early days of Homes England and its old guys was the last remnants of ending the RDAs. And the number of places in the country that were simultaneously attempting to be centres for digital arts and gaming excellence indicated that some sort of rational conversation and prioritisation is necessary to really, really direct meaningful investment around skills. And I fear from where we are at the moment, there might be a sort of grand levelling down if we're not careful. And that's pretty hard to say, given where skills is at the moment.
Great, thanks. Jonathan, what about moving civil servants out of Whitehall? Is this something Localis has thought about or you have a view on?
Yeah, no, we recommended it in our first report on industrial strategy. I've got personal experience. My father was a Whitehall relocation expert. So when I was 7, we moved from leafy Carshalton beaches up to sunny Southport on the Lancashire coast. He moved the health and safety executive, I think from Southwark up to Bootle, or as it became known amongst staff due to the spate of muggings. They made good targets in early 80s, Boot Hill after the Wild West. So, but no, it has a role to play. It's a good decentralisation ploy for decentralisation, moving civil service staff closer to other parts of the region encourages different thinking. It delivers better civil service efficiency on a still rather bloated public estate, which isn't a bad thing. Encourages different thinking, and in terms of things like industrial strategy, skills, for example, you can see it aligning in things like life sciences, biotech, getting elements of bays closer to places like the Oxcamark, the knowledge spines of the future, on which we're going to have to depend on growth outside of London. So it's inherently a good thing. Does it solve the absence of meaningful devolution? No, but it's a good attempt.
Okay, Claire, do you have a view on this one? Apart from welcoming the jobs to Wolverhampton.
Well, as a West Bromwich,
not from Dudley, you might not actually. It might be exactly the wrong. Yeah.
No, joking. I think it's great. I think it's quite funny because there's quite a few regional offices and that have been I think the job centre or a chunk of DWP was up in the northwest, and that's all been closed and gone back just in time for the cycle to come around again and say that it's a good idea. But I think my perspective on this is I used to think that our civil service was extraordinary and world-beating, and I don't think it is anymore. I think the damage that Michael Gove did to it was fairly fundamental. In cutting the size of departments, I wouldn't want to work in those departments anymore. Not that I ever did. And I think the inability of Whitehall to respond to the COVID crisis is something to make government and all those senior people within the civil service ask themselves some really big questions. Because I got really bored in the end of getting letters on a Friday to tell us to do something that the Secretary of State had said on the Today programme on Monday morning that we were incapable of doing in local government. So I think I like the idea. I support it because it can't get much worse, and at least that might, spread the love a little bit. But I don't think that Whitehall and the National Civil Service is the asset that it once was, which is to my great chagrin, actually.
It's interesting. I remember the earlier mentioned Ken Livingstone when asked, when there was an earlier discussion about whether the civil service and government should move out of London, opining, I don't think I'm going to get this too wrong, not I think he'd care if I did, knowing Ken, that somehow it would be good to get all of these offices in Whitehall turned over to a productive use. And I must say, there is a 5-star hotel going into a former building, the former War Office building in the middle of Whitehall. And it will be interesting to see whether the rates that it pays go up or down, because that will be a test of whether it is indeed a more productive use. Anyway, now another question. So Richard Derecki and actually Christine Whitehead, my colleague, has added to this. So Richard asked, agree that devolution is dead. think we must have said that, panel. So Sadiq needs to build a whole set of dynamic relations, city with a capital C, business, unions, third sector, boroughs, to generate the post-COVID recovery. Where does Clare think there is scope, where does Clare think there is scope for closer working between the boroughs and the GLA? To which Christine added, taking Richard's point, what is being suggested is not as far as, oh, it's all moved, hold on. It's not as far as we can see how Sadiq, what is being suggested is not as far as we can see how Sadiq has been the problem. How can he be helped to make that big positive change? Well, anyway, I can't even read the question. My fault, Christine, not yours. Claire, do you want to start on this one? What can Sadiq do to create a kind of coalition?
I think he's already got ideas for how to do that. And I think what he knows now that all of London's boroughs are the other side of their AGMs, we've seen quite a bit of change. We've had 4 leaders go, 4 Labour leaders anyway. And I think, you know, seeing the output from those offices now, there's a brilliant opportunity to set out the scene. What I would say is that I agree wholeheartedly with the points that have been made about business and the point that Richard was making to say that, you know, the ability of City Hall to give out cash, so to have a carrot as well as a stick, has largely dried up because of the TfL situation. So it will be the force of personality, the strength of partnerships and the trust that can be built between international institutions, the city, business and local government that will be really key. And it's why I'm always keen to point out the fact that my borough is politically stable, not like some of my neighbours, and we're open for business. Because that's ultimately, I say it jokingly, but that is what people need to know and need to hear. And I think there's a great opportunity, particularly when we can all be in a room together, again, for Sadiq to really do that. He was doing that during the pandemic, particularly with the business community. So I think actually some really good stuff will come forward now.
Be good. Nick, Jonathan, on this one?
I think the city will notice and the boroughs will notice as a result if Sadiq is on platforms with a wider range of people and particularly investors. Whenever I talk to some of those institutions, they're desperate to feel the door is more open, and I think they will pour in. And both Boris and Ken were very adept at those meetings and those opportunities and using them for further leverage. And I think there's an opportunity to revisit some of that. I also think in the tech space, an opportunity to reconnect with some of those more innovative businesses who, we've heard about how mom and pop has struggled, but actually I think some of those businesses have had a tough pandemic as well, and engaging with and for them will be really important in the next period.
Very good. Jonathan?
I think you saw sort of early signs of this in Sadiq's acceptance speech the other day. Clearly, there's relationships to be repaired in a more pragmatic basis. You know, if you can create stronger, as Nick said, it's about, in Clare, it's about trust and relationship. If there's if there's some tangible ways of doing so would be good, and just using that convening power, since he's not, as you said, we're not going to get the fiscal devolution that's so greatly needed. In terms of levelling up, the danger is London is seen as having more than levelled up already. That's not going to change. I thought it was quite telling, looking at the notes of the Queen's speech, that old canard about London's differentials in transport investment. I thought that had been shot down by the Treasury many years ago. But so essentially, he's just got to use that convening, that power of relationships to bring people together on side. And in terms of narrative storytelling, whatever that's necessary there. London is Open was a good campaign on that terms. Revive that. Find a new story for London and Londoners to pull through, to bring a sense of place pride and patriotism for all Londoners across all 32 boroughs.
Now, very good. Now, I want to ask 2 linked questions that I've got here. One is from Jack Brown, Dr. Jack Brown at Kings, who's just written an excellent book on the way London is, if I can advertise it for you, the way London is perceived around the UK or misunderstood. And his question is, given that successive governments were extremely focused on levelling up the UK economy outside of London and in the post-war years and broadly failed, brackets, apart from in levelling London down, brackets, can anyone on the panel come up with any reason to believe that levelling up might produce different results this time? Now, to which I might add, the linked question is from, I had here a moment ago.
I think it's Dave Hill. So
Dave Hill, who said, I've lost the, where is it? Dave Hill's exit seems to have disappeared from my feed of questions here.
I think that's my fault, Tony, because I was trying to type a cheap answer to Dave.
Okay, well, this was a reference to your reference to, I think your reference to Harold Wilson and Huddersfield. So Harold Wilson wanted to stop the drift south. Why did it go wrong? I think that was what the question was. Nick, are you a historian? I vaguely remember. I mean, this is anyway. You mentioned Huddersfield. So where did it go wrong? Why didn't it work last time?
Partly, I would argue, the wrong bets. So the Wilson government, white heat of technology, chose some really awful industries to back, and didn't have the economic scale to do that. Confused economic and imperial decline, and ended up trying to build Concord and independent nuclear deterrence rather than focusing on the areas of mass economic growth. And I think, where does the hope come from? I think the hope might come from, and I don't think this is just rhetoric, technology and sustainability are going to bring about seismic changes in the nature of the productive economy. And the smart government begins to think about where is that money going to flow to and where is profitability going to come from. So, you know, we got it wrong, didn't we, on diesel? We backed diesel massively when Volvo said almost simultaneously we're going to stop making normally aspirated cars. But we're ahead of the game in biotech, fantastic sustainability and green growth industries. And they are, in part, not just financial based. They're not just electronic transaction based, and there is an element of investing in those, but particularly not just the state investing. I'm a broken record on this. How do you bring together that coalition of city money and international money and funnel it out of London and into other parts of the country? But that is a massive agenda, and I have quite a lot of sympathy with what's behind Dr. Jack Brown's question here, because you're also trying to kind of, you know, to quote another bit of Star Trek, you cannot book the laws of international economics, you know, to misquote them. And it feels like we might just be trying to do that a little bit at the moment.
Okay. And I mean, Claire, you mentioned the fact that, I mean, the West Midlands in the 50s and 60s was seen as so affluent. You could have an industrial policy that sought to take economic, or at least to balance it away from the West Midlands, which is, you know, almost inconceivable to be able to say today. So, I mean, Labour politicians traditionally, and you know, Nick referenced indirectly the Department for Economic Affairs, which tried under George Brown to have this kind of interventionist policy, and it, you know, didn't work. So, how do you think Labour are going to come to terms with this? Because Labour is going to have to respond to it; it can't ignore it. How do you think Labour nationally is going to respond?
How I think they should respond, and what they'll actually
you respond for them, because in fact, without sounding unkind, I mean, you're probably ahead of the game at the moment, so why not go for it?
I think Jack's question is so fundamental, and you know, as a kid growing up in the Midlands, and my dad worked for Birmingham City Council, I can remember just feeling really angry about London and really resentful. And I was raised in that way to see, you know, well, why do they get everything? And literally watching television and like, why does everybody sound like that? Why does nobody sound like us? Even on Midlands Today, on Central News, they didn't sound like us. You know, there was genuine burning resentment. And then you realise that in the capital, everyone's just getting on with it. But I feel as though there's this sort of old-fashioned boring, paternalistic, oh, maybe we give them a little Whitehall department, or maybe, and it's like, does the conversation need to change? And does there need to be a challenging, dynamic conversation to say, well, actually, it's not, you know, London is successful because of all these decisions that have been taken by all these politicians and all this investment and all these businesses that have come here and taken all these risks and all these skilled people. You know, what are you doing in those cities to make that change and make that difference? I did just want to pick up on Harold's really beautiful speech. If you haven't read the White Heat speech in a while, please do, because it's, of course, we can see the flaws in it now, but hindsight's a wonderful thing. But I worked for the MP for Huddersfield, and Harold has a very, you know, very important place in my heart. But one of the wonderful things that he talked about in terms of skills and education in that speech is he talks about the University of the Sky, which became the Open University, and this sort of vision of information being available to everybody, and class and background and level of education that you've been able to achieve, are you getting to a grammar school or not, would be no barrier. And I think there's some really visionary stuff in there that today's politicians would be well to take a look at. But also, I think that speech is special because there's this balance of vision and ideas, but also of the need for intervention and the need for intervention at the right time. I'm also in this mindset because me and my partner watched the other day, when I'd got meetings on, the 1983 election, which you can watch on the telly on YouTube really easily. But it's like how things have sort of changed and come back full circle, you know, and we have to learn, on Nick's point, we've got to learn those lessons as quickly as we can to stop some national politicians dragging us back and keeping us in the dark ages, frankly.
And it's the speech is available online. Actually, it is. If you search it, it is there online. Jonathan, why do you know it didn't really work then, and Conservatives traditionally didn't really believe in industrial policy, so they're now kind of doing something that couldn't be done by a Labour government which did believe in it, and trying to do it rather quickly. So why do we think Conservative politicians now, or is it, as Nick suggests, a sort of short-term series of measures while they try to work out what to do to retrofit an economy which has been moving in a particular direction, arguably structurally, for 50, 80 years?
Yeah, well, can the current government reverse the pattern of all post-war governments in failing to rebalance the economy? I think you're right to make a distinction. There's kind of levelling up, which is essentially quality of life. People can see decay in their immediate social fabric, tatty high streets, and all the rest of it. And essentially kind of, this is seed corn, chump change money in relative terms, which essentially doesn't really touch the size of what's been lost since the 2010 spending review and all that's followed for local government finances since then. So you got to the levelling up funds, and I said catnip for Red Wall MPs bombarding Rishi, do us something for our high street, Rishi, go to that. And beyond that, you really got to know what's happening to industrial strategy. Well, it was very interventionist. Now, obviously, Johnson is the Brexity Hezza, isn't he? If he's going to be the Brexity Hezza, he's going to get his trade deals, gets cheap meat from Australia, presumably, while intervening breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But what's the fruit? What's going to be any long-term realisable benefit from this? Because it seems everything is posited around a 2023 general election. That who's in charge of growth policy? And that seems the move the Treasury campus to Darlington is essentially Rishi Sunak's got his own DEA in a sense, hasn't he? With Michael Gove and the levelling up white paper. Essentially, what we get from that? Maybe a federation of basically Redcliffe mauled on the cheap, 50 to 60 recognisable metro mayors. So he's got like something similar to the US president, able to talk to governors of states, make life lots easier rather than 333 English councils and all the rest of it. But in terms of going back to George Brown, they say the DEA was doomed to fail because it didn't have Treasury support. This is clearly Rishi's. I remember what's the acronym for DEA became known as the department for extraordinary arguments, given anyone's failure to achieve any coherence. So if Rishi does have his hand on the tiller of our economic destiny, there has to be coherence across government as to what are the ultimate long-term goals from all this. There'll probably be a changing of the deck chairs, and who knows what's going to happen to our growth bodies, local enterprise partnerships. Will there be but essentially, Tony, all falls down unless there's strong local leadership to drive place-based growth, on the sense that local leaders, Ben Houchins, Andy Streets, as Sadiq, they have that convening power. They can bring in people together from across business, industry, NHS, the wider public services, to make stuff happen. This will all fall down without any meaningful devolution. So it's really in their hands to make this happen or not.
Presumably with the Australian trade deal so near to being signed, we can expect government investment in kangaroo farms in the Midlands and the North. But no, you think not? Look, anyway, right, James Stevens, I can see the attraction of focusing on skills, but our faith in this may be misplaced. Investment and employment tends to determine the quantity and content of skills training. Skills availability won't necessarily drive employment growth. Maybe we should be focusing upon removing the barriers to R&D, experimentation, innovation, and production. There's a bit of Dominic Cummings here, potentially, but I mean, that is a compliment. Anyway, or is this a very old-fashioned notion, probably postmodern? What about that then? Concentrate, removing the barriers to R&D, experimentation, innovation, and production. So, I'd like to go first on that. Go for it, Nick.
Look, being compared to Dominic Cummings, I may drop off this call if you get that feisty with me, Tony. What I would say in this space is, having spent a lot of time working with the metro mayors and the cities around the country, and having another go at what did Manchester get so right that other cities have really struggled to replicate. And one of my sort of personal reflections, which supports some of what James is saying, is the relationship between the city universities in Manchester, the city's growth dynamic, and the city's investment is very close, incredibly tight. They're almost indivisible. And I'm not sure that higher education institutions across the country are as dynamically linked to place-based growth, to directing investment that takes great ideas and great institutional platforms and turns them into economic motors. And that another way of casting your question, James, would be, what can we do to make sure that the ideas, creativity, and economic benefits that are too often just disappearing overseas, that come out of UK universities, are more closely aligned, and the benefits are shared in the UK. And I think some of that is about having another go at what that partnership between local and regional leadership, research and development, and universities actually is, and making it not just a sort of occasional meeting at some goddamn strategic partnership, but a genuine attempt to co-invest and identify opportunities for growth. And, you know, the work going on at the moment in Bristol at Temple Meads with the relocation of the university's science, research and postgraduate work into a brand new city quarter is a really exciting opportunity to do that. But it frustrates the hell out of me, and I say it quite regularly, that my alma mater, the University of Liverpool, has a giant building on Finsbury Square that it attracts postgraduate students to. It makes business sense for the University of Liverpool. It makes no sense whatsoever for a genuine and serious partnership about driving decentralised growth in the UK. And I regularly pop in to tell them that.
I'm sure they're very happy to see you. Local enterprise partnerships. I mean, I want to, did you mention them, Nick? Somebody mentioned them. Claire, Jonathan, in the context of this discussion, and you know, removing the barriers to R&D, etc., do LEPs have much of a future, or are they a sort of skinny solution to abolishing the RDAs, which now themselves to be gently shuffled off?
So
Sorry, don't mean to put you on the spot.
I think it depends on the LEP, doesn't it?
Okay.
So I can't speak for all of them. I like the idea of LEPs, and I know that there are some been really effective. I think in terms of the R&D point that the questioner put, I completely agree with that. I think, and I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can tear down the barriers to R&D and up the skills and the capability of young people and retraining people to go into that world of R&D. And I think I think the two together would be absolutely magnificent. I would say that work that the UK Innovation Corridor has done has been great. One of the things I was desperate to know was, where are these universities in the corridor and how can we connect with them? You can study every single academic subject at university level that it's possible to study in this country at a university on the UK Innovation Corridor route. There's no reason why people in massive chunks of the country can't access every level of education and every educational opportunity that exists. And I find that idea hugely, hugely thrilling. I've thought long and hard about this because I think it's quite important, and I don't want to be that boring lefty, because I'm not that person, I promise, who talks about student tuition fees. But I do have a stepdaughter who's just finishing her A-levels and doesn't want to, she's a working class northern girl, and she does not want to get saddled with £27,000 worth of debt. She's going to walk away with a suite of brilliant A-levels. She's a STEM girl, she's a geographer, and she is frightened of going to university. And even if it's just a pause for a few years in subjects that we desperately need nationally for our economy, could we not give them a discount? Could we not say, if you want to train as a nurse or in biotech, we'll give it you for free? There are risks inherent in that, but it makes me desperately sad personally and politically that we are losing talent. We really are losing talent that we will never get back.
Okay. Jonathan.
LEPs, taking LEPs in order. We've had like a Damascene conversion at the Carlis. Previously, we had concerns about them, about how locally democratically accountable they were. They've had a good war in the pandemic. They were very proactive to our minds, developing strong recovery plans. Ironically, many of them based around the local industrial strategies, which now seem to be kicked out of the rest of the bathwater. And they're in a current review at the moment. I guess that what will determine their fate is they'll probably be that. I think there's a free market side around Bays, which will say, well, look, we need the voice of business in our localities. They're still the best people to do it. But can we divorce them with that locally democratically accountability hybrid thing, working with local authorities and businesses working in step, which I think is a bit of a shame, because that had the seeds of working something together. But there we go. In the long march of Britain's post-war industrial policy, will probably go again. But I think they will remain in the vestigial form. R&D, with respect to this debate about levelling up or down London, clearly the issue is there's too much of a concentration of R&D in London, as well as across the Oxcam arc, across that knowledge spine. So clearly the government will be looking to distribute this more evenly if they can. But funders do like to put their money where they wish to. Can a free market government buck their own markets in where people want to invest in R&D? We'll soon find out, I will argue. But incidentally, we did a report for Oxford City Council making their case for place as at a local, regional, as well as a national strategic level. And essentially it came down to things like, well, can Oxford City Council have powers to help direct something as simple as a bus station to help physical connectivity? We can talk the high talk about R&D, Dominic Cummings, ARPA-led projects, but ultimately, Tony, it all comes down to buses and bus stations.
Very good. Right. Michael Edwards asks, does the panel, this is a question about whether the entire London economic model is the right one, I think. Does the panel agree that the growth path London has followed produces poverty, i.e. the need for levelling up, especially through low pay and high housing costs? Poverty in London is not persistent pockets which will end with the resumption of growth. I see some nodding and the, who'd like to go on that one? Nick first on that one? I mean, the housing cost, you were trying to do something about indirectly, were you not?
Yeah, so not in the previous role, not responsible for affordable housing in London uniquely, but the answer to this has to be yes. Aspects of the current economy and its dependence on low wages are deeply uncomfortable. I think, again, an opportunity to really go back round the conversation on a London living wage and what it means and where the economic benefits are. I have a sense that in a post-pandemic world, more employers and more organisations feel this is not just a moral thing to do, but makes huge amounts of economic sense as well as they try and pick the pieces up. I'm not convinced it's the entire economic model. I see lots of examples of very good employment practice delivering really effective partnerships, but I'm not sure we've been confident enough in naming and being clear about what is and isn't acceptable. And I know myself, having been a chief exec in a London borough, that particularly during the period of austerity, when you are desperate for the signs of economic growth and inward investment, you're faced with really invidious and uncomfortable choices. And it wasn't always clear to me that we were getting all of those right, and taking some of that pressure away would be really helpful. But I have huge sympathy with that, the sentiments behind that, particularly in some of those frontline jobs.
Claire, I mean, the London economic model works very, very well for some people and clearly relies on other people for whom it doesn't work very well. And that's not new, and it may never have been new. I mean, if you look at Victorian London, but, you know, the Prime Minister talks about building back better and other alliterative words beginning with a B. So how far is it possible to imagine a fresh start, or at least tilting towards a slightly different start, which I think the government itself is, you know, minded to talk about?
I've felt like this since I was elected, but when I, you know, coming in as a new councillor, I was a bit like a builder coming in, sucking my teeth and looking at the state of the housing market and going, you know, God, I don't know who did this, but you know, it's going to be a devil to fix. But I honestly don't know the answer. But I think there are so many politicians nationally who aren't even asking the right question. You used to be able to buy a family home in my borough a decade ago for 125 grand. And now you'll need to find £700,000. It's gone from being expensive to eye-wateringly expensive. And as far as I can tell, it's only people who've sold a really expensive property in Hackney that can afford to buy a really expensive house in my borough. And I don't see enough honesty about that. I don't see enough questions about that. And I can remember becoming leader and people were criticising us for gentrification. It's like there's a limited number of things over which I have no control. I can't control a private individual who owns their home and wants to sell it, and the value that the person who's buying it will give to it as part of that private sale. I have nothing, I have no levers there at all. And there isn't an answer to this. The only answer I can think of is to build as much as swiftly as possible to a really high standard that is also affordable. But the developers don't see benefit in that, and the decision makers haven't managed to force people to do it at the right price. So I wish I had the answers, but do I hear answers coming out of MHCLG? Nope. I wish I had the answers.
Okay, very honest. Jonathan.
Yeah, so taking on the affordable housing issue, does London's growth model suggest poor living standards? Well, perhaps to an extent. There's in terms of the agenda for today's debate, levelling London up or down, there's always a lot of concern in the home counties that London's not pulling its weight, that through the London plan, it's not building enough homes for its people, and therefore they're going to lovely places like central Bedfordshire and fouling up the housing markets there. So there is, and I was speaking to a sort of a senior local government leader in a home county the other day, and essentially they're saying that the whole agenda is money going up to the north for levelling up, whilst they get the hospital pass of having to build more homes, which is political death. And the South East doesn't want, they said that they don't want the infrastructure because people don't want the housing growth. We don't want any of this. But clearly, that London's affordable housing must be dealt with. Maybe as a result of COVID, we're obviously not sure what the population of London is going to be post-COVID. People are citing maybe gone down by 300,000 or more. But essentially, before we even began this debate, there's a very instructive, for me at least, conversation going on between Nick and Clare about kind of housing busts they'd done in their part. I thought your one in the Papa John's, Nick, took that. And this is no important issue. People's quality of life in London is very poor. Citing Jack Brown's book, The London Problem.
Yeah,
it's never factored into this. There may be higher wages in London, but you factor in paying half your wages or in rent. It's not fun. It's not good. So can the model be changed, or maybe the answer is to disperse London's population in some measured, controlled way? Answers there come none. But the creation of more affordable housing has to be centre, fore and aft of this, I'd suggest.
Okay, now we're coming to the end of the event, and there's a sort of intriguing sort of culture war-y question here, which I do want to read out from Sudhir Junankar, who says, how does the levelling up agenda of the government link with its cultural focus on flags, the national anthem, and its anti-wokeism? And I want to kind of Londonize it and bring it slightly closer to today's topic, because it's an interesting question. We all know what that question means. Is that, in a sense, is London's reputation, I think Claire kind of hinted at this, reputation outside London, in that it's seen as somehow being, it or its people are inimical to things of this kind mentioned in the question. And is that a fair observation about people in London? So I want to sort of slightly get it away. I mean, it's a good question, and I know exactly what the questioner means, but is there something about London's take on things that makes it unlike the rest of Britain in some way that matters? Jonathan, pick on you this time, then.
Sure. I guess the thing is that the levelling up is about promoting pride in place. Essentially, you have a tarted up high street, nice civic amenities. You'll feel a lot happier. You might be more likely to vote Conservative. Who knows what the causal connection could be? But in terms of London, flags and all the rest of it, and obviously London is the West. It's not. It's the political capital. It's the capital of England, but you don't see it recognised. You don't see St George's flags flying on St George's Day in April down the Mall or anything. What's it come to? But essentially, the main thing is that values. The values of Londoners are not out of kilter with the rest of the country. They are very aligned. In fact, in some parts, due to religious and ethnic makeup, parts of London are far more conservative than you give credit for. So I think that's values should trump any kind of jingoism or flag waving, I'd hope.
Yeah, there's a very interesting report by another think tank, Theos, last year about the social attitudes of London, and they are curiously conservative in a strange way. Well, not that strange, actually, entirely explicable way, as the report explains. Nick, and then we'll come to Claire for the final word.
I'm okay, I think, with London being slightly different because it's the point of cities. And I think the challenge for levelling up is not the flag-based challenge, it's the challenge of creating equal choices. So what is the choice between living in a city with all of its challenges or living elsewhere in the country with a different set of but potentially equal challenges and different economic opportunities? And we know what's behind the sort of flag waving issues, but actually what that ignores is there is also, you know, in the community I live in, discomfort and uncertainty, even from large immigrant communities, about what's happening in other parts of the cities. These are different tensions just playing out at different levels. And I think actually what we need to have a conversation about is how we give choices and opportunities for individuals rather than this just being a kind of vortex that sucks everything towards London. I think instead we've got to have a set of questions around, and what are the imagined economic alternatives for other places that give people choices?
Great. And Claire, last word to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think I've had some of the most socially illiberal conversations I've ever had to have with residents in London who are anti-gay rights, anti-feminist, and that's real and that's every day. I think the trick to this, because I love the question and I love Tony's spin on it as well, what I would urge to get us through all of this is for all Londoners, when they're commenting on the flag, on faith, on football, on all the other stuff that's associated with Blue Labour, amongst other things, but we mustn't look like we're sneering at people, because I think that's how it's come across. People feel that they're being sneered at and patronised, and actually what's important to them is important to them. And that's as valid as opera being important to me and caring about how Leighton Orient do. You know, these things it's about a question of respect between us as individuals and not being sneered at, I think.
I was with you till the Orient.
Enough. Thank you. Jonathan, say nothing about football or we'll be here all... Now, you can, of course, but put it in the chat. Thank you all, Jonathan, Nick, Claire. You've been a great panel. We've covered a massive amount of territory on what is a very interesting and lively and indeed contemporary issue. But I just want, before we finish, to hand over to my colleague Christine, who wants to say a little word about this is the last of this series of events, and about them and the future. Christine.
Okay, thank you, Tony. We've been trying, not totally successfully so far, to make sure that there is a review of each of the sessions, the 6 sessions, Tony, we've had.
Thank you.
In case you didn't know.
Can't count.
And there will be a blog, a blog on the web which will carry us through what's been happening before the mayoral election. Afterwards, we would like, and I say this on air, to talk to Dave about how we might continue to do certain things in the On London space, because it's a very good outlet for us. Mm-hmm. And we will, I think, try to continue to run a number of small events or even larger events, given the way the Zoom works, over the next few weeks and months as things change. I think
that's it. Okay.
So we'll probably have one in June, certainly, and maybe a little bit more.
Okay,
well, thank you, Dave, for your very rapid response.
Thank you, Dave, for your very rapid response. Thanks everybody for joining us. We've had a good audience today. I'd like to again thank our 3 speakers, and having promoted Jack Brown's excellent new book, and we've now promoted On London. Of course, Localis is a great pro-local government think tank, so everybody should go to their events as well. Nick. And of course visit Waltham Forest to shop and whatever Nick wants. So, right. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the week and look forward to seeing you again very soon. And thank you all for coming today.